Today's scripture reading brings us to the book of Romans, and what a wonderful, wonderful book this is. And so much that's going to be found in these pages, and I will not be in any way able to expound upon all of the things that you can find in this wonderful book. That's why for our Second Mile Fellowship, we are reading through each chapter twice. Because, as I said, you could read it 10 times and still find things there throughout. Now, I want to get through here and show you some of the breakdowns. I will give you some highlights as we're going through, some things hopefully that you can take away from the scriptures, and it might be a blessing unto you. And as always, if you look down in the descriptions, you'll have the way I have the chapters broken down as well. Verses 1 through 7 I have simply as Paul's greeting. And it's a basic greeting, but there is one thing that I want you to notice, and that is when you look at verses 1 and 2 and put those together, you understand that the gospel of God is something that didn't just start with the New Testament, but he says that which he had promised afore by his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. The gospel of Jesus Christ was not an afterthought. It was not some secondary plan. It wasn't the plan B after man could not abide by the law, so therefore Jesus had to come. It was always the plan because God knew that man could not abide by the law before it was ever given. And if you continue reading in Paul's writings, he'll tell you the main purpose of the law is not for our righteousness, but to show us our unrighteousness. So you have Paul's greeting in the first 7 verses. Verses 8 through 15, I have that titled as Paul expresses his desire and intent. And a few different desires that he mentions here is desire to visit them. He wanted to and has been wanting to for a while. And he wanted it for mutual comfort. Both in verse number 12, you see that I may be comforted together with you by the mutual faith both of you and me. Paul wanted to comfort one another and also have fruit. He wanted to have fruit of the Roman Gentiles as he had there in Corinth and as he had in other places throughout his missionary trips. And then we see the intent is mentioned, and that's verse number 15. That's to preach the gospel to them. Verses 16 and 17, I have that just separated out by itself, and that is titled, Not Ashamed of the Gospel. And I love these two verses. I'm going to go ahead and read them just because, they're just good. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone, not some, but to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Now, something to note here, if you want to mark it down this way, and that is verse number 16, speaking about the gospel, it makes man righteous. But verse number 17, it also expresses or declares God's righteousness. That's the beauty of the gospel. It makes man righteous, but also declares the righteousness that is in God. And you'll see more on that as we get into chapter 3. The remaining verses of chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, I have that titled, The Wickedness of Man and God's Wrath Revealed. Because in these verses, you see just the total depravity of man. That's what Paul is trying to get across, is man is just inherently wicked. And then also God's anger against that wickedness. Because once he gets into chapter 3 and he starts explaining how salvation comes about, you have to understand that you need to be saved, and that's what chapter 1 does. Chapter 2 talks about the judgment of God, something to be saved from. And in chapter 3 continues the thought of both 1 and 2, and then you see the change that happens there in verse number 20. And we'll get to that. That's good stuff. But just something to mention here in these last few verses. I want you to see that verses 19 and 20 speaks about how God has revealed himself unto man within them and through nature. But man, verse number 21, man's pride has lifted him up. And verse number 22, he changed God from being perfect and holy and divine to something that is corruptible and base. Now, from verses 23 through 28 speaks specifically of the sin of sodomy. And what makes this, it's important for 2 points. Number one, there's a lot of people who try to excuse the sin of sodomy, and they say, well, Jesus never said anything about it. Oh, it's not really mentioned in the New Testament. It's mentioned here, okay? So that's only one thing to understand, because the other thing to understand is he lists 23 sins. That's the number I've got, give or take one, through verses 29 through 31 or 2. He's talking about just how wicked man is. But the one sin that he spends time on, multiple verses, is the sin of sodomy. Now, when he is expressing the total depravity of man, it's important that we understand that the one sin that he is really stressing out of all of these sins is that one. And that really goes to show that the sin of sodomy is essentially the pinnacle of sin, in essence, because you are sinning against God's creation, you're sinning against his very nature, and of course, against yourself. That's something. At least it is to me. When God lists the unrighteousness of man, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, and he lists all these things, but yet the one that he really spends time on is that, and how the men also with men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves a recompense for the error which was meet. That really says something about the depravity of that sin, and of course, man's sin altogether. So that's it. Romans chapter 1. It's really an amazing chapter in an amazing book, and I look forward to going through it with you through the rest of this month. So God bless you, and Lord willing, we'll see you tomorrow.